The stories presented in this video are real, but we have changed the characters' names and altered images to protect their identities. The creator of this video is not an investigative officer. These narratives have been sourced from various internet platforms. Our intent is not to accuse or target anyone in particular. Thank you for understanding.
Prison life X years, no chance of parole. At the conclusion of each video, you hear me speak these words. They are threatening to put vile criminals and wrongdoers in prison for life. We fail to see, however, that the jury's exact verdicts at sentence are limited. In the end, many of these heartless murderers do get away with it. In 10, 20, or 30 years, many do make it out. After taking the life of an innocent person, the offender in this case has already been released from prison for about a year. Mackenzie Cowell, 17, was only 2 months away from becoming 18. She wanted to work in the beauty industry while she was a high school student. However, on February 9, 2010, she abruptly disappeared, leaving the people of Washington in shock. However, it was unexpected that the person responsible for her disappearance was someone she saw on a daily basis. You'll be left stunned and incensed by the horrific and astounding case of Mackenzie Cowell because, despite the fact that it has been solved, you have to question whether justice was truly done. Welcome to True Crime Stories Hub, your go-to channel for daily true crime documentaries. Each day, we dive into chilling real-life cases, unraveling shocking mysteries and uncovering hidden truths. From infamous crimes to unsolved puzzles, our documentaries bring you the stories that will keep you hooked. Tune in every day for your dose of gripping true crime content. Reed and Wendy Cowell welcomed Mackenzie Nicole Cowell into the world on April 1, 1992. Mackenzie was a senior at Wenatchee High School at the time of the crime, and she resided in Orondo, Washington. Mackenzie's parents described her as a lively and content girl. Mackenzie had a passion for dancing, as evidenced by her participation in the school's Applets dance team and her membership in a Wenatchee dance studio. While studying hard in 2010, Mackenzie also spent time with her divorced parents. Her mother, Wendy, began seeing a man named Joey Fisher, and her father, Reed, later began dating a lady named Sandy Francis. Mackenzie was simply pleased for her parents, despite the fact that any child could be affected by this significant shift in the family dynamic. Besides, she needed to organize her own life. Most young children, at the age of 17, struggle with their profession choices, life goals, and other issues, but Mackenzie was clear about what she wanted to achieve. Although she excelled academically, she chose to participate in the Academy of Hair Design's cosmetology career training program in downtown Wenatchee. And now Mackenzie was really passionate about hair and makeup. She even posed at the academy because she wanted to be a beautician. This training was a win-win situation for Mackenzie. She may earn that extra credit for her transcript and gain practical experience as a cosmetologist. It is reasonable to assume that Mackenzie had a plan for her future and was determined to see it through to completion. Mackenzie was a determined young woman with big goals who wasn't afraid to strive high. She was likable by almost everyone because of her ambitions and goals. Being the kind of person who didn't mind having fun, Mackenzie loved to put herself out there and was born to stand out. According to all accounts, Mackenzie was living a happy and satisfying life and was headed for greatness. However, everything changed on a fateful day in February 2010 when Mackenzie disappeared from the Academy of Hair Design. In Washington, February is chilly and windy, with lows of about 19 degrees. In fact, Mackenzie experienced a similar day in Washington on February 19, 2010. She was working at the academy, and the air was a little cold. Mackenzie made the decision to go out for a while at 3 p.m., and she even asked her academy friends if it was acceptable for her to do so, and they said it was. A bundled-up Mackenzie was seen making her way to the parking lot on CCTV. Shortly after getting into her 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix, she pulled out. According to cell phone records, Mackenzie texted her boyfriend Joaquin, asking him how he was doing. Unfortunately, though, Mackenzie would never use her phone again after this. Mackenzie didn't appear to be in a rush, and her companions estimate that she will only be gone for 15 minutes. However, more than 15 minutes passed with Mackenzie nowhere to be seen. Mackenzie's friends were first unconcerned about this. They assumed she had changed her plans and was simply running late. Mackenzie would get dinner with her father, Reed, on Wednesdays and spend the evening watching movies, which is another reason why her friends were slow to notify the police that day. Since it had long been a father-daughter routine, Mackenzie's acquaintances assumed she must have lost track of her dad's time. They were unaware, however, that Mackenzie was also not with her father. Reed actually kept waiting for Mackenzie to arrive so they could have supper together, but she never did. Mackenzie didn't respond when an anxious Reed called and texted her numerous times at around 5 o'clock in the evening. Reed was a complete mess at about 8 p.m., which was Mackenzie's curfew, and he was terrified and very concerned about his daughter. Reed was aware that this wasn't typical of Mackenzie, who was a trustworthy, accountable, and on-time girl who never missed a curfew and always answered her phone, regardless of how busy she was. Reed decided to report 17-year-old Mackenzie Cowell missing because he could not wait any longer. Thankfully, the police acted immediately when Reed informed them of his anxieties and concerns of Mackenzie's absence from home. The detectives made the decision to search everywhere for Mackenzie. Despite checking in with her friends, her mother, Wendy, and even her boyfriend, Joey, Mackenzie had disappeared without any trace. She hadn't gone back to the academy, and her car was missing as well. Mackenzie's phone was going to voicemail on every call, and the Cowell family's worry was deepening with each minute that went by. Their thoughts kept going to the idea that Mackenzie had suffered a horrible fate or was in danger, even though they didn't want to believe it. The Cowell family's situation only got worse from here, and it all began with a phone call. However, it wasn't from Mackenzie as they had hoped. The police sent it. The cops had called to report a strange discovery. Near his driveway, a local resident discovered an abandoned red automobile. Mackenzie lived in Orondo, some 40 miles away from the location, which was close to Mission Ridge. The investigators quickly hauled the automobile in, examined the license plates, discovered that Reed was the owner, and recognized the model as Mackenzie's Pontiac Grand Prix. However, Mackenzie was nowhere to be seen, and the young girl who had gone missing was not having a nice time finding her abandoned automobile. Mackenzie's purse was discovered inside the vehicle, but her debit card, phone, and keys were gone. There was a single set of footprints in the soil around the automobile. With a flurry of questions racing through everyone's head, the investigators took it all in and made the decision to examine the car in detail. Why would Mackenzie leave her automobile behind and frequent a far-off place she had never been to before? And what happened to her possessions? The Cowell family and the police were now persuaded that something was seriously amiss, and Mackenzie's disappearance was no longer merely a case of a missing person. A thorough search was conducted after Mackenzie's car was found, involving both air and ground searches with the assistance of a helicopter in order to look for any hints. Volunteers from the community searched everywhere for Mackenzie, and the detectives even contacted the FBI for help. But another discovery was uncovered 4 days after Mackenzie vanished. It was horrifying, and it made the Cowells even more terrified. A woman's body was discovered at a resort hamlet about 20 miles from Wenatchee, on the banks of the Columbia River close to Quincy, Washington. A vacant house that was for sale at the time was just 50 yards from the body. The woman was dressed entirely in the black academy uniform that Mackenzie had been wearing the day she vanished. At a distance, there were several garbage bags and abandoned duct tape, and her feet were in the water. Tragically, Mackenzie Cowell, 17, was identified as the woman shortly after this finding. According to the results of the autopsy performed on her body, Mackenzie died from strangulation and cuts to her neck, although she had sustained blunt damage to her head. The fact that the murder weapon, a long, sharp, serrated knife, was discovered embedded in her shoulder makes it even more horrifying. Fortunately, there were no indications of assault in her autopsy. Mackenzie's family learned of the terrible news of her death following the unfortunate finding of her body. Mackenzie's parents were devastated by their daughter's untimely death and found it hard to comprehend that a young, intelligent girl who had never harmed anyone had been subjected to such cruelty. At that time, the Cowell family realized they needed closure and that holding the perpetrator accountable was the only way they could secure justice for their daughter. The Mackenzie Cowell Task Force was formed by the police with the responsibility of identifying persons of interest and possible suspects in Mackenzie's case. The first person the detectives suspected was Joe Akin, Mackenzie's lover. He consented to take a polygraph test but failed, which made the cops suspicious. Since Mackenzie and Joey had a rather intense disagreement the day before she vanished, they also suspected Joey, Mackenzie's stepfather. However, the detectives had to start over because both guys had flawless alibis and were immediately exonerated by the police. After interviewing over 800 persons, the investigators obtained several leads. Since 1997, the Mackenzie Cowell case has grown to be the biggest multi-agency investigation in the Wenatchee region. However, a woman called Liz Reed soon provided the detectives with an odd clue. Though I'm not sure how the college student factor actually factors into this, her version of events seemed credible, yet she turned out to be an untrustworthy source because she was a drug addict, dealer, police informant, and a college student. Liz, however, claimed that Mackenzie had been murdered in a case of mistaken identity by two other drug traffickers, Emmanuel Siraz and Sam Cuevas. The two men acknowledged to killing Mackenzie by saying, quote, "I choked her to shut her up." Liz even went so far as to claim that she witnessed a snuff film. Liz was able to describe the murder weapon before it was made public, so it wasn't something everyone knew, which is why investigators accepted her version of events. Furthermore, despite Mackenzie's parents' claims that they had never seen it, Liz provided the police a ring that appeared to be Mackenzie's, and they verified this by displaying an old photo of her wearing the exact band. Liz said that Sam told her to go to a waste site to collect the ring when she was asked where she got it. However, shortly after making this confession, Liz said she had made it up, and investigators were able to verify that neither she nor the two men she had mentioned had any connection to Mackenzie at all, nor were any of them present at the crime scene on the day Mackenzie was killed. The investigators were left perplexed by a very complicated case and leads that ended in dead ends, but they continued to search. The evidence they had gathered so far had to provide them with a clue, so they went over each letter until they found one in particular, the details of which would completely change the course of the case. The letter from Theo Keyes, a police informant, was the most important tip the detectives got from the general public. Theo claims that Mackenzie's disappearance was the work of his friend Christopher Wilson. Did the letter actually have anything to do with Mackenzie's death? And where were Christopher and Theo? As far as Theo was concerned, he was incarcerated for inappropriate public behavior and had a history of mental illness. Despite the fact that this tip seemed to be giving the investigators a lot of déjà vu, they chose to investigate it nevertheless, and they were happy they did because Christopher Wilson in particular had a number of coincidences in this tip. We do know that Christopher Scott Wilson was a fellow student at the Academy of Hair Design, where Mackenzie was enrolled, but that is all we know about him. The dude was 29 years old, had black hair colored, and exuded a gothic vibe. By appearance, he appeared to be a quiet, typical man. Chris, however, was said to have an obsessive preoccupation with death and serial killers in Theo's letter. Additionally, Chris was a sucker for the crime thriller series Dexter. In addition, Chris had a tattoo of Hannibal Lecter from the film The Silence of the Lambs on his arm because he admired the character. This next paragraph may make you uneasy, but enjoying gloomy stuff doesn't exactly make someone a textbook murderer. As you can see, the detectives discovered that Chris was a frequent participant in a number of internet communities for serial killers. Chris was also employed at Telford's Chapel of the Valley, an East Wenatchee morgue, according to investigators. Friends report that Chris had said he liked, quote, cutting people up, which is just crazy. Chris was called in for an interview on August 11, 2010, and at first he was really helpful. He said that he only knew Mackenzie as a classmate, despite Theo's letter claiming that Chris had a crush on Mackenzie and that they were developing a romantic relationship. Take it as you will, though, as no one can verify this information. Chris even consented to provide his DNA during the interview, and when it was compared to the DNA on the duct tape discovered at the site, it turned out to be a match. These disclosures were all pointing to Chris as a potential suspect in Mackenzie's premature passing. When Chris was brought in for another interview in October, he became uncooperative, stopped speaking, and sought a lawyer when he was asked if his DNA matched the DNA found at the scene of Mackenzie's death. Chris was taken into custody on October 6th, charged with second-degree murder, and released on $1 million bond. Chris was arrested for reasons other than DNA, though. You see, Chris was the one who left the academy shortly after Mackenzie did on that particular day. It couldn't have happened by accident that a man who fit Chris' description was spotted where Mackenzie's car was left behind, according to another story. If that wasn't enough, the police also investigated Chris's old residence, a rented flat 3 blocks from the academy. Upon initial inspection, nothing seemed unusual, but then a luminol test was performed. There was a single patch of carpet where it shined. Despite the fact that the apartment was cleaned after Chris left, the authorities found this evidence to be quite valuable. A large spot of dried-up blood was found beneath the carpet. Upon testing, this blood matched Mackenzie's. Additionally, cell phone data revealed that between 3 and 3:42 p.m., Mackenzie's phone last sent a ping from the same vicinity of Chris' flat. On the day that she vanished. Someone came forward throughout the investigation to describe their own encounter with Chris prior to Mackenzie's abduction and eventual death, and it was safe to say that it was anything but nice. According to a lady called Shauna Novak, Chris reportedly attempted to choke her until she passed out during a party, which is horrifying. Chris apologized and claimed he didn't mean to hurt her when she insisted that he stop. This scenario doesn't really make sense to me, so I'd love to know how it actually transpired. In any event, Shauna was clearly traumatized by this and was certain that Chris was attempting to hurt her. What Chris might have done if she hadn't retaliated. By this time, Chris was the target of mounting evidence, and the investigators were positive they had their man. Another turn of events, however, provided additional insight into Chris's role in Mackenzie's demise. Tessa Shillman, Chris's ex-girlfriend, was the subject of another arrest by the police in December 2011. She was accused of assisting Chris in concealing any evidence of the crime. You see, when the detectives searched Chris's computer, they discovered a ton of Tessa's pictures and videos. Tessa was acting as a corpse at the same spot on the carpet where the blood stain was discovered, which made them unsettling. Additionally, the detectives discovered a video on Tessa's phone that captured Chris and Tessa strolling around the flat on June 24, 2010. There was a noticeable huge reddish-brown stain on the carpet when the camera pans to it. 4 days later, another video showed Chris questioning if the apartment was tidy as he walked about it. In a terrifying response, Tessa said, "Yes," taking into account what had transpired. Despite its ambiguity, it is a chilling remark in light of what we now know. According to later phone records, Chris and Tessa spoke on February 9th at approximately 3:32 p.m. That's not all, though. That same evening, Chris and Tessa made 5 more phone calls, and despite having a fully functional car of his own, Chris even borrowed Tessa's vehicle. Additionally, Tessa called her current boyfriend on February 9th at around 9 p.m., who also happened to live in the same neighborhood as Mackenzie's, which is close to the Columbia River. She said something bad had happened and requested him to pray for her. A knife and cigarette butts were discovered in Tessa's car during a DNA check, but the results did not match the DNA recovered from the crime site. However, Chris was awaiting trial and detectives had a lot of evidence against him. In April 2011, Chris was charged with first-degree murder instead of second-degree murder. Chris was presented with a plea agreement prior to the trial, which called for him to enter a guilty plea to first-degree manslaughter and face 6.5 years in prison. Surprisingly, though, he turned down the offer. John Henry Brown was Chris's defense attorney. If you're a true crime enthusiast, you're aware that Brown is among Seattle's most well-liked criminal defense lawyers. He has represented a number of well-known criminals and notorious serial killers, such as Ted Bundy and Colton Harris Moore, well known as the Barefoot Bandit. The foundation of Chris's defense was the police planting of the blood discovered in his old residence. For some reason, Chris's employment background, his strange fixation on Dexter, and even his frightening Hannibal Lecter tattoo were all off-limits to the prosecution in a funeral home. However, the prosecution conjectured that Chris had somehow enticed Mackenzie into his flat, where he killed her. In all honesty, we don't know if Mackenzie voluntarily met Chris or if she was seduced, but at the end of the day, neither of them left the academy with any correspondence between them whatsoever. The prosecution thought Chris took Mackenzie's body from his flat to the Columbia River after killing her. Then he left her car outside of Mission Ridge. Chris ultimately received a second plea bargain that called for a 14-year prison term for first-degree manslaughter of Mackenzie Cowell. Strange as it may sound, he accepted this plea bargain. Christopher Wilson was sentenced to 14 years and 3 months in prison after being charged with first-degree manslaughter, first-degree robbery, and second-degree assault in an unrelated case. Chris insisted on his innocence throughout that entire period, saying that he only accepted the plea bargain because he thought he wouldn't receive a fair trial. It would be more appropriate, in my opinion, to say that Chris chickened out as the trial progressed because he realized how much evidence the prosecution had against him. Tessa, on the other hand, was not disciplined and was allowed to leave. Although it was determined that there was insufficient evidence to establish Tessa's involvement in Mackenzie's death, it's strange to consider that she and Chris spoke on the phone several times on February 9th, the eerie yet enigmatic films, and the call she made to her boyfriend. Did Tessa just manage to avoid a bullet? Was she truly unaware that Chris had killed Mackenzie? We'll never know, unfortunately. We'll never really know, but it's entirely possible that Chris made up a wild narrative about the large stain on the floor, and Tessa believed it and went along with it as a sincere joke. Chris attempted to withdraw his guilty plea shortly after being sentenced, but the Washington Court of Appeals denied his request. He was eligible for parole in 2023 after doing time at Larch Correction Center and subsequently being sent to Monroe Correctional Center. After completing his sentence, Christopher Wilson was released from prison on December 11, 2023. He is on probation until December 2026 and will have to report to a community custody officer for the following 3 years. On February 25, 2010, a memorial service for Mackenzie was conducted in Wenatchee. With nearly 1,800 people in attendance, Mackenzie's high school dance team paid homage to her before launching hundreds of pink and purple balloons into the air. Everyone felt empty and tormented after hearing heartfelt speeches and hearing about Mackenzie. Every time Mackenzie's family remembers her happy and sincere smile, they experience moments of anguish and grief. The Cowell family was left to pick up the pieces following Mackenzie's departure, and they are still in shock at the eerie loss of such a lively person in their lives. Mackenzie had so much to look forward to in her life, and she would have left her mark on the world. In the end, this situation leaves you vacillating between satisfaction and discontent. Was justice served to Mackenzie? Well, both yes and no. Yes, because the criminal was apprehended. But no, because 14 years is insufficient, and the fact that he is now free just serves to heighten the gloom and terror of this situation. The idea that Chris's family supported him in spite of DNA and numerous other incriminating pieces of evidence is unsettling. Many people are rooting for Chris and criticizing the legal system for condemning someone who wasn't guilty. However, there is a very slim but real possibility that Chris was innocent all along if you truly give him the benefit of the doubt. For instance, we don't know of any relationship between Chris and Mackenzie. All we know is that they attended the same school. Although there were speculations that the two were starting a romance, there was never any proof of this. We don't even have any proof that the two had previously exchanged any words with one another. Even worse, a lot of people think Mackenzie's mother's boyfriend might have been responsible for her death since the day before she vanished. She got into a heated argument with her mother and left the house after telling her that she couldn't have both her mother and her boyfriend. Although the boyfriend had a purportedly strong alibi for the night of the attack, you had to wonder because alibis have been shown to be untrue numerous times in the past. The most significant piece of evidence, however, supports Chris's allegations that the blood in his apartment was planted by the police. He could perhaps be telling the truth. You see, given the severity of Mackenzie's injuries, she would have lost a staggering quantity of blood during the assault, but other stories indicate that the amount of blood discovered in his flat was extremely minimal. Is this proof that his apartment wasn't the actual crime scene, or is it proof that it was planted? Or is it proof that, despite covering his residence with plastic, he left a tiny hole in it? We simply have no idea. Although I do believe Chris did it, you have to acknowledge that there is some space for reasonable doubt. I'm not defending him in any way. However, if Chris is indeed responsible for the crime, which I think he is, why is it so annoying? For what reason did Chris kill Mackenzie? There isn't even a motive. This case is really tragic. You can't help but think that Chris's punishment for taking Mackenzie's life was merely a slap on the wrist, even if the offenders served their time. It is impossible to imagine the feelings Mackenzie's family must be experiencing now that their daughter's murderer is at large. We can only hope that they find comfort and peace in the memories Mackenzie shared with them throughout her incredibly brief 17 years of life. We appreciate your interest in this new True Crime Stories Hub episode. As always, though, please remember to subscribe and see this other fascinating case I discussed if you like this video. It keeps you updated on all of my upcoming videos and is completely free.